October 2022. Hidalgo County, Texas. The livestock auction had already ended when 22-year-old Maren Ellsworth noticed the battered livestock trailer parked behind an abandoned feed warehouse. Most people walked past it without slowing down. They were too busy talking about cotton prices, another dry season, and the foreclosure notice that had quietly appeared on the gate of Maren's family's pecan orchard 3 days earlier. Someone inside the trailer growled. Not loudly. Weakly. The sound made her stop. A volunteer from the county sheriff's office muttered to another man, 40 honey badgers. Came from a private wildlife park that shut down. Nobody wants the liability. The word spread through the crowd faster than wildfire. Honey badgers. In Texas. Starving. People laughed because the situation sounded too ridiculous to be real. Maren didn't. She stepped closer until the smell reached her. Hunger had its own scent. The animals weren't pacing or snapping at the steel walls. They barely had the strength to lift their heads. One honey badger stared at her through the rusted ventilation holes. It didn't look angry. It looked exhausted. The county wildlife officer folded his clipboard shut. Licensed sanctuaries are full. Zoos declined. If we can't relocate them soon. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Maren knew what happened when no one claimed expensive animals. She also knew something nobody else in that parking lot cared about. Her orchard had become strangely quiet. 4 months, fewer owls hunted at night. Coyotes had stopped crossing the creek. Even the hawks seemed to circle somewhere else. Meanwhile, gopher tunnels spread beneath the pecan trees like cracks through old glass, chewing roots that should have lasted another 50 years. The timing felt impossible. She looked back at the trailer. Then at the wildlife officer. What would it take to foster them? Silence. Someone laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. A contractor leaned against his pickup and grinned. You can't even save your own orchard. More laughter followed. Maren didn't answer. She simply waited for the wildlife officer to stop blinking. You understand these aren't pets? I know. They're one of the toughest animals on Earth. I've read about them. They'll require reinforced holding areas, permits, inspections, veterinary supervision. I know. He studied her worn work boots before glancing toward the faded Ford 8N tractor parked beside her trailer. The old machine had belonged to her grandfather. Its paint had faded decades earlier, but the engine still started every morning after exactly 2 pulls of the choke. So why would you even ask? Maren looked beyond the auction yard toward the distant rows of pecan trees barely visible against the October sky. I think my land needs something. The contractor burst into laughter again. Lady, he called across the gravel, what your land needs is money. Even the wildlife officer smiled. Only an elderly man standing beside an aging stock trailer remained silent. His name was Ellis Crowder, a retired wildlife rehabilitator whose rescue permits had expired years earlier. His weathered hands rested on a cedar walking stick polished smooth by decades outdoors. He looked at Maren for several seconds before speaking. Sometimes, he said quietly, hungry animals notice things full stomachs ignore. That was all he said. But Maren couldn't stop thinking about the sentence. By sunset she had signed temporary emergency care documents that surprised everyone involved, including herself. The paperwork came with conditions so strict they filled nearly 30 pages. Veterinary oversight. Double fencing. Daily inspections. State monitoring. Failure meant immediate removal. Success seemed almost impossible. The contractor shook his head as she drove away with a reinforced transport convoy following behind. There goes her orchard. Word spread across Hidalgo County before sunrise. The girl with the failing pecan farm had brought 40 starving honey badgers home. Neighbors parked along the roadside just to watch. Some expected escaped animals. Others expected disaster. Children counted fences through binoculars while adults placed quiet bets about how long before the state shut everything down. Maren ignored them. Every morning began before daylight. She repaired old livestock panels, reinforced gates with reclaimed oil field pipe, checked water tanks, mixed veterinary-approved meals under careful supervision. The honey badgers ate cautiously. not greedily. Almost as though they had forgotten food could appear every day. One, however, behaved differently. It never joined the others immediately. Instead, it walked the entire perimeter of the enclosure first. Always clockwise. Always stopping near the same corner where the fence overlooked the oldest section of Marin's pecan orchard. Every single morning. Ellis noticed it too. He stood outside the enclosure one chilly dawn and watched the animal sniff the breeze for nearly 5 minutes without moving another step. "That's strange," he murmured. "What is? It isn't smelling food." "What then?" Ellis never answered. Instead, he walked toward the fence line separating the enclosure from the orchard. Halfway there, he suddenly stopped. He crouched, scooped up a handful of loose soil, rubbed it between his fingers, then looked toward the oldest pecan trees with an expression Marin couldn't read. "The ground shouldn't be this empty," he whispered. Before Marin could ask what he meant, something inside the enclosure made every honey badger freeze at exactly the same moment. Not 1, not 5, all 40. Every head turned toward the orchard together. And then, without a sound, they began digging at the fence as if something beneath those aging pecan trees had been waiting for them all along. By the next morning, the holes along the inside of the enclosure had doubled. Marin measured them before sunrise with the handle of an old shovel. None reached beneath the fence, yet every tunnel pointed toward the oldest pecan grove as though the honey badgers shared a destination no human could see. She had spent her life reading weather, soil, and trees. She had never seen 40 wild animals agree on anything. Ellis arrived carrying nothing more than a faded notebook and a dented canvas bag. "They dug again?" he asked. Marin nodded. "They stopped the moment daylight came." Ellis knelt beside one of the tunnels. Instead of looking into it, he pressed his ear against the ground. After several quiet seconds, he stood. "I hear movement. Gophers." He slowly shook his head. "Too much movement." The answer explained nothing. It only created another question. 3 days later, the first county inspection began. Pickup trucks lined the gravel drive while neighbors gathered outside the gate pretending they were simply passing by. County Wildlife Inspector Brenda Holloway stepped out with a clipboard thick enough to stop a bullet. "So you're the young woman everyone keeps talking about?" "I suppose." Brenda looked past Marin toward the reinforced enclosure. "I've inspected bears, wolves, mountain lions, even escaped zebras." She paused. "But this," she glanced toward the honey badgers, "is a first." The inspection lasted nearly 4 hours. Fence height, steel anchors, feeding records, veterinary logs, drainage, water quality. Every requirement passed. Barely. Before leaving, Brenda signed the temporary approval papers. "You've done better than I expected." The contractor standing beyond the fence muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Give it another week." Several people laughed. Marin kept repairing a loose gate hinge as though she hadn't heard. The weather shifted during the second week. A cold front rolled across South Texas, pushing dark clouds over Hidalgo County. Rain finally arrived after months of dust. Most farmers welcomed it. Marin didn't. Not immediately. She knew heavy rain often revealed problems hidden beneath the surface. By evening, shallow streams formed between the pecan rows. She walked the orchard with a flashlight while the old Ford 8N idled near the equipment shed, ready to pull fallen branches if necessary. Lightning flashed. For a single second, she noticed dozens of fresh mounds scattered across the orchard floor. Not molehills. Larger. Far larger. She counted 20 before giving up. The rain erased the rest. Something underground had become active. The next morning, Ellis returned carrying an old metal soil probe. "My father used one of these," he said. "They're simple." He pushed the steel rod into the earth beneath one of the oldest pecan trees. It stopped halfway. "That's odd." He tried again 3 feet away. Same result. Again. The rod struck something hard beneath the roots every time. "Rock?" Marin asked. Ellis frowned. "No." "What then?" "I don't think nature put it there." That afternoon, Marin visited the county archives. She wasn't searching for wildlife records. She wanted old property maps. The clerk disappeared into the back room and returned with rolled survey drawings from the 1940s. Dust drifted into the afternoon sunlight as she carefully unrolled them across a wooden table. Her orchard looked different. Smaller. But something else caught her attention. A narrow line crossed the property where no modern road existed. She traced it with her finger. "What is this?" The clerk adjusted his glasses. He leaned closer. "Looks like an abandoned irrigation pipeline." "From where?" "Probably connected to the old community pumping station." "When was it removed?" The clerk shrugged. "According to these notes." He squinted. "It wasn't." Marin stared at the faded blue line. If the pipe still existed underground, why had nobody mentioned it? That evening she told Ellis everything. He didn't seem surprised. Instead, he unfolded his notebook. Inside were handwritten observations dating back nearly 30 years. Animal trails, groundwater levels, pest cycles, rainfall, migration patterns. One page stopped Marin cold. It showed repeated notes about unusually large colonies of pocket gophers appearing every 15 to 20 years. Each outbreak followed one sentence. Old irrigation route disturbed. "You've seen this before?" Ellis nodded. "Twice." "What happened?" "The second time." He hesitated. "An entire orchard died within 4 years." Silence settled between them. Finally Marin asked the question she dreaded. "Can mine still be saved?" Ellis closed the notebook. "I don't know." It was the first time she had heard him admit uncertainty. Days later, something happened that nobody expected. The honey badgers stopped digging. Completely. 40 animals. Not one touched the fence. Instead, they gathered quietly along the eastern side of the enclosure. Watching. Listening. Waiting. Every evening at exactly the same time. They weren't looking at the trees. They were staring toward an overgrown drainage ditch nearly 200 yards away. Marin watched them for 3 nights. The behavior never changed. On the 4th evening she walked toward the ditch herself. Halfway there she noticed fresh claw marks in the mud. Not from the honey badgers. These tracks were smaller. Hundreds of them. The ground seemed alive with tiny tunnels weaving beneath the grass. She knelt beside one opening and brushed away the loose soil. A faint current of cool air drifted upward. Underground. There was space beneath her feet. Far more space than a simple gopher tunnel could explain. She looked back toward the enclosure. Every honey badger was still watching her. None of them blinked. As the last light faded across the orchard, she heard something she had never heard before. Not growling. Not scratching. A deep, hollow rumble echoed beneath the ground itself. Then the earth beneath the oldest pecan tree gave the slightest shiver. Marin didn't move. The trembling beneath her boots lasted only a second, but it was enough to send a flock of grackles exploding from the pecan canopy. The orchard became strangely quiet afterward, as if every living thing had paused to listen. Ellis reached her a minute later, breathing hard. "You felt it too?" She nodded. "It came from underneath." Ellis looked toward the oldest grove instead of the drainage ditch. "No," he said softly. "It traveled underneath." That answer stayed with Marin all night. At first light, she borrowed a ground-penetrating radar unit from the Agricultural Engineering Department at Texas A&M through a wildlife researcher who had begun following the unusual rescue. The equipment looked complicated, but operating it wasn't. A small antenna sent harmless radar waves into the soil. Different materials reflected those waves differently, creating a picture of what lay beneath the surface. Most people imagined soil as solid ground. It wasn't. Healthy soil was filled with tiny spaces carrying water, air, roots, fungi, insects, and countless living organisms. When something unnatural interrupted those layers, a buried pipe, a collapsed tunnel, or compacted earth, the radar could reveal it. By noon, the first scan appeared on the monitor. Marin frowned. "What am I looking at?" The engineer zoomed in. "These straight lines are the old irrigation pipeline." "And these?" He pointed toward dozens of irregular dark shapes surrounding it. "They're hollow. Hollow. There shouldn't be this many underground chambers. Animal tunnels." He hesitated. "They've become connected." Connected. The word echoed in Marin's mind. The pocket gophers hadn't simply dug tunnels. Over years, they had turned the abandoned irrigation corridor into an underground highway stretching beneath nearly every mature pecan tree. The old roots no longer rested on firm soil. They were hanging above empty space. If enough tunnels collapsed at once. She didn't finish the thought. News spread faster than she expected. By the weekend, university researchers, wildlife officers, and neighboring orchard owners were standing beside her gravel road. The contractor who had laughed on auction day came too. He folded his arms. "So the badgers found holes." One researcher answered before Marin could. "They found something much bigger." The contractor rolled his eyes. "They're still dangerous animals." Nobody argued. Honey badgers were dangerous. That wasn't the question anymore. The real question was why 40 starving animals had detected a hidden ecological disaster weeks before trained professionals. No one had an answer. The following evening delivered one. As the sun disappeared behind the pecan trees, every honey badger became active at exactly the same time. Instead of pacing, they pressed against the eastern fence. Watching. Waiting. Then something emerged from the tall grass beyond the drainage ditch. A pocket gopher. Then another. 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 Within minutes the field seemed to ripple. Hundreds of pocket gophers poured from hidden tunnel entrances, moving toward the orchard like water flowing downhill. The researchers stood speechless. One whispered, "I've never seen behavior like this." Neither had Ellis. Pocket gophers usually avoided open ground. These weren't avoiding anything. They were relocating. Running. Escaping. From what? Then the first honey badger let out a sharp bark. The others answered instantly. Every muscle in their bodies tightened. Not with panic. With purpose. State wildlife officials arrived before dawn the next morning. After reviewing emergency permits, they approved something no one expected. A tightly supervised ecological trial. Small groups of honey badgers would be released inside temporary fenced orchard sections under constant observation. Failure would end the experiment immediately. Success. No one dared predict success. Marin opened the reinforced gate herself. The first 4 honey badgers stepped into the orchard without hesitation. They didn't climb trees. They didn't attack wildlife. They ignored fallen pecans. Their noses stayed close to the ground. Within seconds they found the first tunnel entrance. One disappeared underground. Another followed. The orchard became silent. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The doubters exchanged satisfied smiles. They've escaped underground. Before anyone could respond, the earth burst open 30 yards away. A honey badger emerged dragging an enormous pocket gopher before disappearing again. Another surfaced nearby. Then another. The researchers began counting. 23 active burrows collapsed within the first hour. By sunset the number had passed 80. The contractor slowly removed his hat. For the first time since meeting Marin, he wasn't smiling. Over the next 3 months, the orchard transformed. Trail cameras revealed something remarkable. The honey badgers never hunted randomly. Night after night, they followed the same underground corridors mapped by the abandoned irrigation pipeline. The connected tunnel system began collapsing naturally as abandoned burrows filled with rainwater and loose soil. Owls returned first. Then red-tailed hawks. Coyotes appeared along the creek again. Native snakes reclaimed hunting grounds once dominated by exploding gopher populations. Nature wasn't replacing one predator with another. It was rebuilding balance. Ellis watched the changes from the porch one cold December morning. "People think ecosystems are machines," he said. "They're orchestras." Marin looked toward the orchard. "What does that mean?" He smiled. "When one instrument disappears." He pointed toward the honey badgers working beneath the trees. "The whole song changes." She never forgot those words. Spring arrived earlier than expected. The oldest pecan trees had struggled for years. Many neighbors believed they were beyond saving. Then something happened no one could explain at first. Tiny green buds appeared. Not on one tree. Not on 10. Across the entire oldest grove. Healthier. Denser. More blossoms than anyone remembered seeing. Researchers tested root systems and discovered dramatically reduced damage beneath the trees. The underground assault had nearly stopped. Word spread across South Texas. Then across neighboring states. Orchard owners didn't ask whether Marin was telling the truth anymore. They asked whether the conservation program could be expanded. Whether licensed wildlife partnerships could protect struggling orchards elsewhere. Waiting lists began forming months before the final research paper was even published. 1 year after everyone laughed at the starving honey badgers. People were calling every week hoping to learn from a farm they once mocked. Then, on the first morning of April, Marin noticed something in the oldest section of the orchard that made her set down her harvest basket without a word. Morning sunlight filtered through the oldest pecan grove, turning the new leaves almost translucent. Marin stood between the rows with her harvest basket still resting where she had dropped it. She wasn't looking at the trees. She was looking at the ground beneath them. For years, the orchard floor had been scarred with fresh mounds of loose dirt, collapsed burrows, and exposed roots. Every walk through the grove meant watching her footing. Now the earth looked different. It lay flat and firm beneath the trees, covered with native grasses and fallen pecan leaves instead of fresh tunnel spoil. She knelt and pressed her hand into the soil. For the first time since inheriting the farm, she felt resistance instead of emptiness. The ground no longer echoed beneath her boots. Ellis walked up beside her carrying 2 pecans from the previous season. Without saying a word, he cracked one open. The kernel inside was full, bright, and healthy. He handed it to Marin. She smiled for the first time in months. Not because the pecan was perfect. Because the tree that produced it had been marked for removal only a year earlier. Quietly, Ellis spoke. People thought you rescued 40 starving honey badgers. He looked across the orchard. They don't realize they rescued this place too. The sentence stayed with Marin long after he walked away. The university researchers returned that summer with final data collected from 12 months of monitoring. The results surprised even them. Pocket gopher activity had dropped by more than 80% within the managed conservation zones. Root damage decreased dramatically. Young pecan saplings showed stronger growth. Native predators, hawks, owls, foxes, and snakes, had naturally returned as the ecosystem stabilized. The honey badgers had never become permanent orchard workers. They had become temporary restorers. Once the ecological balance returned, their role became smaller with each passing season. Nature had finished what it started. Exactly as it should. The contractor who had laughed the loudest arrived one humid August afternoon. This time he came alone. His pickup rolled slowly up the gravel drive before stopping beside the old Ford 8N. He removed his hat before speaking. "I owe you an apology." Marin looked up from repairing an irrigation valve. "You don't owe me anything." I laughed. "You weren't the only one." He shook his head. "I've spent 30 years believing every problem could be solved with bigger machines." He glanced toward the orchard. "You reminded me that sometimes the smartest tool isn't made of steel." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he reached into his truck and unfolded a set of engineering drawings. "I've been redesigning drainage systems for nearby orchards." He smiled awkwardly. "I was hoping you'd look them over." Marin accepted the papers. Not because she wanted to prove she had been right. Because working together would help more farms than winning an argument ever could. Within 3 years, the abandoned wildlife rescue had become something entirely different. Under state supervision and with wildlife biologists overseeing every step, the property evolved into a conservation education center. The honey badgers were never sold. Never treated as farm equipment. Never turned into a business attraction. Instead, they became ambassadors for habitat restoration and responsible wildlife management. Students visited from universities across Texas. Farmers attended workshops about healthy soil, predator-prey balance, and protecting native ecosystems. Researchers published studies showing that damaged landscapes often recover fastest when natural relationships are restored instead of replaced. Marin rarely stood at the front of the room. She preferred answering questions while repairing fences or checking irrigation lines. She believed people listened better when their hands were busy. 5 years later, Hidalgo County looked different. Several neighboring orchards had restored wildlife corridors instead of removing every patch of native brush. Old drainage ditches were redesigned to support both farming and local wildlife. Ground-nesting owls returned. Red foxes became common again. Healthy ecosystems spread farther than property lines ever could. The old Ford 8N still started every morning after exactly 2 pulls of the choke. Visitors often asked why Marin never replaced it. She simply smiled. It still remembers how to work. Ellis didn't live to see every change. He passed away quietly during his 86th winter. Among his few belongings was the faded notebook he had carried for decades. Inside the front cover, beneath years of observations, Marin found one final sentence written in careful handwriting. "Watch the quiet things first. Nothing else. No explanation. No farewell. Just 5 words." She framed that page and hung it inside the equipment shed beside the old tractor. Every new intern read it before their first day in the orchard. 10 years after 40 starving honey badgers arrived in a rusted trailer, journalists still asked Marin the same question. "What made you believe this would work?" She always gave the same answer. "I didn't." The reporters usually looked confused. She would smile and continue. "I believed nature was telling us something. All I did was stop long enough to listen." That answer appeared in newspapers, research journals, and farming magazines across the country. Yet the people who knew her understood something deeper. She had never tried to make honey badgers solve a farming problem. She had tried to understand why they behaved the way they did. The solution had belonged to the land all along. As another October settled over Hidalgo County, golden pecan leaves drifted across the orchard while a cool breeze moved through the branches. Beyond the restored grove, the conservation enclosure stood quieter now, its remaining honey badgers healthy and strong, waiting for future transfers to protected habitats whenever wildlife officials called. A pair of red-tailed hawks circled overhead. An owl settled into an old nesting box before sunset. The Ford 8N rested beside the barn, its faded paint glowing softly in the evening light. Marin walked the orchard one last time before dusk, running her hand across the rough bark of the oldest pecan tree. The ground beneath her boots was steady. The trees whispered with life. And somewhere beyond the grass, hidden beneath the peaceful orchard they had helped restore, the wild had quietly remembered its way home. If this story reminded you of a family farm, an old piece of equipment, or someone who taught you to pay attention to the quiet things in life, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Stories like these live on because people choose to share them. And if you enjoyed this journey, there's another remarkable tale waiting, about an ordinary object that everyone dismissed until it transformed an entire community in a way no one saw coming. Until then, thank you for watching, and take care of the land and the stories that grow with it.